Dare great things for Christ. Christ calls us to dare great things. In the marketplace, as well as in the mission field, there has never been a time like the present for the spirit of the Catholic entrepreneur. Now is the time for men and women of great courage and great vision to engage our church and our culture. Now is the time to dare great things. And here is your host as we dare great things, Father Nathan Cromley, the president and founder of the St. John Institute.
Christian leaders need help to lead just like anyone else. Usually we turn to the Gospels or the lives of the saints or other Christian leaders for inspiration. But sometimes it's important to read those whose positions are antithetical to Christian leadership. Sometimes we can learn a lot more from those who operate differently from us to show us just how special our position is. One of these people is Robert Greene and his 48 Laws of Power. I begin this series with a commentary on the preface from this book and Greene's insistence on our thirst for power. Hey everybody, so glad to be with you. We're going to kick off a new series here, and I'm excited about it. I want to teach with you on Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. Okay, so this was a book that came out in 1999. It's sold well over 1 million copies. It's been translated into more than 24 different languages now. It's been commented on by all kinds of people. Michael Jackson commented on it. Jay-Z commented on it. It was kind of a phenomenon in the early 2000s, right? At the turn of the century when it came out, of course. And the reason I want us to read this together, not necessarily read it, but comment on it, is so that you understand, well, some of the genius of the book, because the reason why the book sold so many copies and has such an influence is because, well, in many aspects, it's very true. But at the same time, to be able to decode from what we think is true and what appears to be true in the book, also maybe a worldly perspective that shows us just how important it is for us to lead differently from the book, right? To actually lead in the footsteps of Christ and in the light of the gospel. Sometimes when you're only in a Christian bubble and all you hear are Christian things, it can be almost, you could take it for granted. And you could say, okay, well, this is the Christian way, and because I'm a Christian, I believe these things. And we can become bored with the light. We can become bored with wisdom. And this, we should not ever get bored of the light, okay? Or bored of wisdom. We can take it so for granted that we forget that other people are out there in our same society who are operating under a very different framework of thought. And that framework of thought, when you compare it to Christianity, helps actually show just how beautiful the Christian proposition is. And I know a lot of you are saying to yourselves, well, I'm not even quite sure about this whole Christian leadership thing. I just am a leader and that's enough. Why do I have to bring Christ into everything? You know, and we look for our leadership development in different places. And it's not to say any of that is wrong. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of it that's really good. But it is to say that if you are not yet convinced about just how special it is and the unique value proposition that the gospel brings to leadership itself, well, then you need to spend a little bit of time reading those who have a whole different perspective. And one of those is Robert Greene, right? So we've done this elsewhere. This is the third of our anti-leaders in our series here on Dare Great Things. The first we talked about was Machiavelli. He was a medieval writer who basically said, if you're good, the good guys come last. So if you want to actually thrive in the world, you mustn't be good. Instead, become Machiavellian, right? Then the second anti-leader that we looked at was Saul Alinsky. And we looked at his, different philosophies on how you develop political power and take over the country, for example, by political force. Very interesting, both of them. And we presented a series so that you didn't have to necessarily read the book, but you could understand the power of their thinking and what makes us different as Christians. And then I want to do this series now on Robert Greene, who really wants to try to extend the influence and the thought of Machiavelli to today's world. And basically he's saying, right from the preface of his book, that what Machiavelli said was right. And based on that, he's going to bring out these 48 laws or 48 rules that he thinks show that Machiavelli was right. And also they kind of decode the 48 rules that anyone throughout history who's claimed power in the world has followed. And of course, the insinuation here is that if you indeed read this book, you could put it into practice and claim power in the same way. And he even says that in the preface. He says, listen, we all crave power and we thirst for power. And those who don't have it want it, and those who have it want even more, right? Based on that, how do you curate power? He says, well, follow these 48 laws. And then he goes even so far as to say, if you don't follow these 48 laws, you will lose power. So it's not even an option of like, this is one way amongst others. For Green, this is the way that you curate power, period. And if you don't, if you don't follow these laws, it will be to your peril as a future leader. Right? So really a really fascinating book, really fascinating claims. And when you read it, you're really struck by just how alluring, in fact, it is. So he gives the law in a brief format, but then he gives all kinds of historical examples, going over 3,000 years of history and in all kinds of cultural contexts to kind of prove the validity of the law in question. Right? So, and then sometimes he'll even put in there people who didn't follow it and the negative effects that happened in their lives because they didn't follow his 48 laws. So it's really a very bold claim that's got a lot of research behind it, a lot of historical examples. And of course, you could pick it apart if you wanted to. And I intend on, time to time, kind of picking it apart to say like, look, this isn't even a really valid form of argument, but it's alluring, it's seductive, and it's got a lot of truth in it. And so I want to take a look at that because I think if we operate without Christ, we will find ourselves locked into these 48 laws of power. But we who operate with Christ, we operate with a different sense of power. And that's something when you almost by looking at the anti-leader, you look at the truth of the leader whom we follow, Jesus. And by following him, you also become more convinced and convicted of just how important it is that you lead in him, how important your leadership is in his footsteps. Right? Because if by looking in the darkness, you understand better the light. If you're always in the sunlight, you might take it for granted. So when you turn off the lights, you suddenly realize just how wonderful it is to actually have light in your life and just how beautiful the teaching of Christ is. So the book itself is laid out. We have a preface, and then he goes through the 48 laws of power. It's pretty simple. And he goes in detail through each one, the history behind them, etc. So we're going to start with this preface today because this is always important when you're reading a book like this to read the preface. You want to read the preface and you want to read the conclusion and the table of contents. So you get a perspective, but the preface is where the author says, okay, here's my angle of attack. Here's what I'm actually trying to accomplish in these 48 laws of power. And so by reading it and understanding it, we are able to get an insight that is kind of like the light that shines on the rest of the book. And for Green, so Green is very blunt about what he intends for the book right from the beginning. If you look at the very first line in the preface, he says, the feeling of having no power over people and events is generally unbearable to us. When we feel helpless, we feel miserable. No one wants less power. Everyone wants more. I mean, it's a great way to open the book, right? Because he's basically saying that if we're honest with ourselves, everybody wants power. That power, because what is he equated with? Power is equated with agency. So your ability to do things, to be free in your life, to make decisions that are consequential for yourself, well, this is part of your innate human dignity. And for Green, he speaks right to that. He says, okay, well, if it's part of the human being to be able to direct their own life, well, then power is necessary for every human being who lives. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. I think that's what makes the book so driving and so compelling. It's because we're like, yeah, he's right. I mean, nobody wants less power. Everyone wants more. But you see, there's going to be a twist to it. He's going to end up redefining power away from agency into what kind of like political championship, where you're at the top of the pile and where you can do anything that you want. That's a little bit of a nuance, right? It's actually a big nuance. Away from, okay, everybody wants to be able to lead their life well and to lead, for the sake of something else, almost saying that power is for the sake of the good, right? Which is what the Christians would say. Christians would say, well, of course we all want power so that we can do good with it, so that we can obey God's law, so that we can spread the love of God further. Not just for our own self-exaltation. Well, he's going to then twist that and say, okay, since everybody wants power, let me redefine it by a much more materialistic and a lower level. And then he's going to champion that. And that's what's so important about this for the whole book, is that you remember that what he's saying sounds so compelling because there's a lot of truth in it, right? But we are, as Christians, are called not just to live by the truth of our lower nature, but to live by the truth of our higher nature, to live for a power at the service of love. And that opens us to a different language of power than what Green champions. Not the power of the victor on top of the podium, but the power of the crucified on the cross.
Would you like to hear more from Father Nathan? Join the St. John Leadership Network and receive a 2-minute glance at the gospel every Sunday morning right to your phone. To learn more, go to www.stjohnleadershipnetwork.org/member and join for free today.
There's a lot that's very compelling in what Green outlines here for us in his 48 Laws of Power. And if we look at the preface, he really is he appeals to our common sense. And that's why it's so compelling. He quotes Niccolo Machiavelli, right? Who says, any man who tries to be good all the time is bound to come to ruin among the great number who are not good. Hence, a prince who wants to keep his authority must learn how not to be good and use that knowledge or refrain from using it as necessity requires. And this is really important because we're going to be going through some of the laws, the individual laws that he puts out, just to kind of highlight his thought and how that's applicable or not to us as Christian leaders. But this is the driving context for the whole thing, right? That quote. And it's a very powerful quote. What Machiavelli is basically saying is, if you want to win in the world, then you have to play by the world's rules, right? This would be something very similar when you see our Lord standing in front of Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate saying, don't you know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you? And Jesus points him up and says, you would have no power over me unless it was given to you by my Father above. Right. So now there's a really powerful setup for us here to explain these two perspectives. Jesus ends up being crucified by Pontius Pilate, who chooses to use the power he has over Christ as if he was its sole arbiter. And this is where the Christian comes in to understand. Yes, Green, you're very right? If you want to be a champion in the world, you have to play by the rules of the world. I mean, to a degree, we can understand that. Even our Lord says, you must be coy as a serpent and simple as a dove, right? Guileless as a dove and coy as a serpent. But to be coy as a serpent, it means to understand that, well, in this world, there are ways people operate to claim positions of power. And if we want to be relevant in this world, or we want to speak into those realms of power, we have to know how the game is played. And this can be very useful. But you see, herein lies all the difference. For Machiavelli, and therefore for Green as well, that is the end goal. That power is for its own sake. And man, what teenager doesn't feel this, the lust for power in this way, right? All the teenagers, we want to be the guy who gets picked first on the team. We don't want to be the last place person. We want to be the valedictorian in the class. We don't want to come in second. And they say, well, why? Because if you get a valedictorian status, then you can get a scholarship. And if you get a scholarship, then you can get into a good school. If you get into a good school, then you can be hired by a good company. And we just keep on wanting to climb that ladder. Go after that next apple that's in front of us. And if you get into a good company, then you can do your own company. And if you do your own company, then you can grow the company. It's amazing. And you take over a company with 4 employees and you end up with 60. Why? Because you're good. It's a validation of self. But I just kind of have a question for you, right? What is found at the top of the ladder for you? Because this quest for power that he outlines here, Green outlines in his preface, he's saying it's a fact. It's a constatation. This is him saying this is the truth. Is it your truth? And I think if we're all honest, there's an element of that's true, right? This element of success, this desire for ambition, which might actually be something that's very much a part of love, right? If we're striving for it, for the sake of something greater. This is really, is there any problem with King David being king? Well, there'd be no problem with King David being king if he was a good king, right? But if he's a bad king, well, then there's a big problem with it. And so it's not just that you are at the top of the ladder. This is not the goal, because there's absolutely no limit to what that ladder is. You can always go bigger, always go more powerful, always go broader. So really the question is not whether or not we have power, but are we having it for the right reason? It's very similar to what we have when we think about time in our life. You only have so many hours in a day and so many days in a year. I mean, people make graphs about this, right? It's really compelling. They make these little squares, and then they show how many little squares represent the weeks of your life, and it actually looks pretty small when we really look down to it, right? So if you know that, and you know that therefore everything that you say yes to, you're saying no to something else. Well, the real genius of living life well is to say yes to the right things, right? And to focus on the things that really matter. Green actually even refers to this in one of his laws, which is, kind of in a puzzling way, because I'd like to say to Green, listen, is power really the end goal? Like you say, we all want more of it, but you never say why, except to do what you want. And I think that Christians can meet Green's thinking here, and anyone in the world that's this way. I remember I was at a bank, and as a priest, it's always amazing when you're talking to bankers. And I love we're talking with my young bankers, because they're usually very ambitious people. And they'll meet with me, as a client in order to build up their numbers, in order to rise higher up into the big company. And one time I was speaking with one of them, and I said, listen, why are you doing this? And he said, money. And I said, well, what are you going to do with the money? He said, have power. And then I said, and what are you going to do with the power? He answered with this kind of glib smile. He said, make more money, But he was very content with that answer. I was not, because I'm like, it's a circular argument. Even Aristotle, way back as Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, he actually says this. He says, it would seem that money and power are the highest goods. But this cannot be so, because they themselves are for the sake of something else. Like, you don't have money and power just to have them. You have money and power for the sake of something else. And Aristotle says, well, for the sake of being able to contemplate the highest truths and being able to have friends, right? To have a worship of God and a true friendships in your life. It kind of reminds me of that last line that we see from It's a Wonderful Life, where the protagonist in the story, gets saved by his friends. And then, the little herald, the angel, leaves him a card and puts the card in the Christmas tree, opens it up, and it says, no man is poor who has true friends, right? Well, you could kind of think that maybe that's a different type of philosophy. Indeed it is. It's a different type of philosophy. To say that the end goal is friendship or the end goal is God, well, that's a philosophy that coincides very well with the gospel and with the life we have in Christ, right? Whereas Green's philosophy here is just an endless running after the next thing. He never says, and then you will have power. He just says, then you will have less power than you could have if only you employed these rules better. It kind of reminds me of Dante's first circle in hell, where the first circle in hell are these men who are running endlessly around in prairies, following this banner, someone who's saying, follow me, and they all have to follow, running incessantly, and they can never stop running. They're always on the look for something new, something different. They never rest. And that's the first circle of hell for Dante. And I think that that's kind of what a lot of us can feel like it. Green is literally enticing us, seducing us, making it look amazing to seek after power. But be careful, my friends. He never says what it's for. A Christian will also seek after power, of course, as a platform and an ability to bring the love of God more effectively into our world. That's a higher mission. And it takes what Green's saying, but it elevates it, purifies it, and puts it at the service of something much greater than itself. Power at the service of the love of God.
Would you like to start your Thursday mornings with a scriptural leadership lesson? Join the St. John Leadership Network, where Father Nathan hosts a 30-minute call at 6:30 a.m. in all 4 U.S. time zones. To learn more, go to www.stjohnleadershipnetwork.org/member and join for free today.
I'd like to just point out some very interesting things that Green puts out. His preface is worth reading. It's really a very interesting read. He says, for example, he goes through the various people who don't believe in what he's saying. So if you say, well, you know what, I'm a Christian, and so all that you're talking about, this seductive act of power, where he basically says you have to deceive people into giving you power and trick them. I don't like that, right? So he quotes Napoleon, who says, place your iron hand inside of a velvet glove. Or he makes reference to the courtiers, or the people of the court of the kings back in the day. And he says, while appearing the very paragon of elegance, these courtiers had to outwit and thwart their own opponents in the subtlest of ways. The successful courtier learned over time to make all of his moves indirect. If he stabbed an opponent in the back, it was with a velvet glove on his hand and the sweetest of smiles on his face. Okay, you can say, oh my gosh, this is evil. I don't want anything to do with this book. Well, you mean like many people have said that, but I want you to understand some of the power of what he's saying here, because it's present inside of you. I don't know a single human being who is not going to be touched by this tendency or this temptation, to put it more bluntly, right? To use power for its own sake. Okay, that's what the temptation is. That's where the foundational critique of Green comes in his book, is that we cannot allow ourselves to be so desirous of power just for its own sake, but we are. We just got to be honest about it. Otherwise, the Bible would never have said that the love of money is the root of all evil. Right? But in fact, that's what the Bible does say. So let's look at this. He first of all, he says, some people say that this is an evil thing to be in the quest of power, right? They believe that you can opt out of the game by behaving in ways that have nothing to do with power, right? But he says, then he warns the reader, you must beware of such people, for while they express such opinions outwardly, they are often among the most adept players at power. That's amazing. So people always say, you know what? I don't have anything to do with that. Well, what he's saying is that they are utilizing strategies that cleverly disguise the nature of the manipulation involved. They will often display the weakness and lack of power as a kind of moral virtue, saying, I'm not with the powerful, I'm with the simple and the weak, right? But here's what Green says. True powerlessness without any motive of self-interest would not publicize its weakness to gain sympathy or respect. Making show of one's weakness is actually a very effective strategy, subtle and deceptive in the game of power. So you see how he does this, right? He's actually saying, by you saying, I am for the humble and the meek, you're not being humble and meek. You're actually saying, by saying that, I want to advance my cause, advance my agenda. And he says, there you are, my friend. You're actually using a law of power. He actually says it's his 22nd law of power, which means if you surrender to the enemy quickly, well, then the enemy will let you be. So you can stay in your position saying you're not fighting, but the very fact that you say you're not fighting is in fact a tactic of war. So I mean, that's kind of amazing. He goes on to describe other people. Other people say that they're not into this, and why? He says they want to demand equality in every area of life. Everyone must be treated alike, whatever their status and strength. Right? But then he points out, if you want to avoid power by saying everybody is equal, you're actually making yourself, by that decree, the most powerful person in the room. Because as soon as you say that, well, then how are we going to who's going to elevate the poor and who's going to debase the rich? Well, the person who says everyone's equal. So now they've become the most powerful person. You see, again, it's like a little bit of a masquerade here. He says, he's saying you can't get around the fact that there's always power at play. Right? Even if you say there is no power at play, you're exercising power by the very statement that there is no power. Right? He finally gives another way. He says, people say, I'm just going to be perfectly honest and straightforward. Authenticity is the way around this. I will not seek power by deceit and secrecy. Right? But he says, being perfectly honest will inevitably hurt and insult a great many people, some of whom will choose to injure you in return. No one will see in your honest statement as completely objective and free from some personal motivation. And they will be right. In truth, the use of honesty is indeed a power strategy intended to convince people of one's noble, good-hearted, selfless character. It's a form of persuasion and an even subtle form of coercion. Right? Because if you're honest and good and straightforward, well, then of course you should be given the power. So you can see, I mean, he goes on throughout this preface, but I want to strike now at the kind of the heart of what he's saying here, because it can be, his argumentation can be really seductive. You can read this and say, oh my goodness, he's right. Well, it's always the case when you're in the presence of a powerful lie, that there's going to be a lot of truth. It's like an apple. Most of the apple's good, but the core is bad. So you don't want to bite down to the core, because then, in fact, you'll touch the poison. And there's a lot of poison in here, obviously. There's a poison of individualism. There's a poison. This is not a Christian philosophy, everybody. This is an anti-leader. This is a non-Christian way of thinking. But why is it non-Christian? Of course, there is much that is right here. If we look honestly at ourselves, anytime we try to advance even the agenda of Christ, we're trying to advance it using power and power structures, power techniques. If you want to get your kids to pray the rosary with the family, what do you need to do? You need to entice them in. You need to cajole them in. You need to entertain them. You need to make yourself, to someone that they want to follow. Leadership always implies a power. There's always this decision people make to be a follower of you, because of the power that you wield. Okay, so, and that includes in the family. It includes with your spousal relationships. It says that power is not the problem, right? For a Christian, we understand that. Maybe we need to become more aware of it. If we as Christians had more power, we could do more good. So serve on boards, be in foundations, direct the course of events to the degree that you can for the sake of the good, right? The Christian difference here with Green is that our thirst ought not to be for power itself, okay? That the quest that we have for power is only because we have fallen in love with a love that is worthy of the very best of ourselves. And then we use power for good, and there's a limit to it. It's not just power for power's sake. It's not unlimited. There's a limit to it, and there's a place where we can go into excess. And that's what we're going to look at as we continue to study and look at each of the laws of power, or at least some of them, that Green puts forward for us.
Dare great things for Christ.
Share your feedback with Father Nathan. Send us an email at communications@stjohninstitute.org. That's communications@stjohninstitute.org. And visit www.stjohninstitute.org and sign up for our newsletter to receive updates from Father Nathan.